Every weekday morning, you'll find the same group of up to a couple dozen local Steinbach men gathered for coffee at Steinbach Fly-In Golf Club's Village Green restaurant. The tradition began approximately 15 years ago and became such a regular gathering, the Village Green began reserving the group's special table. As of this past weekend, there is one less familiar face around that table with the passing of Steinbach's George Pauls, a beloved figure in the Steinbach community, known as much for his love of golf and curling as his unending generosity and community mindedness. Kelly Holliston, a longtime member of the Village Green Coffee Group, became friends with George Pauls more than 2 decades ago.
We moved to Steinbach in '89, and we had a restaurant in town. Worked hard at it, and I remember one day this gentleman came in and asked if I'd be interested in joining he and a group of friends on a golf trip down to Roseau, Minnesota, or to Warroad actually. And it was George Pauls. I didn't know him, but I was just honored that this guy would invite me along. And through that, I got involved in the golf course here, became very close friends with George and his whole group of friends, and just gained nothing but respect and friendship for George over the years. Truly one of the most amazing people I've ever known.
Dale Foreman, another member of the group, moved to Steinbach in the early 90s and met George on the first tee box at a tournament being hosted at Steinbach Fly-In.
I said to myself, no, what's he done to me? Here's a fella, George was 66 then, and of course everybody knew George had one arm. And I thought I could play golf a little bit, and by the time the day was over, he'd beaten me by 6 strokes.
George Pauls was known for his competitive nature, and despite the loss of one arm during his service with the Queen's Own Cameron Highlanders during World War II, was a fierce competitor on the links, as Brian Gunther, head professional at Steinbach Fly-In, can attest to.
George was an amazing golfer, especially years ago when he played. He had a competitive edge, which he really wanted to play well, and the score was what it was about. It wasn't about how he did it. He did have one arm. He had incredible hand-eye coordination. My first memory of George is when we played golf together. I was 17 years old, junior golfer here, and George and I went to play golf. I think it was kind of raining and nobody else wanted to golf, and so George and I went. And early on I saw that, number one, he was I think reaching out to a junior golfer, which was great. But number two, he wanted to play, and I thought I could probably beat him, and we went off. And after the 16th hole, he was up 1, and he ended up beating me by 1. So I had 78, George had 77, but he loved the game of golf, and he loved the people around the game of golf, and that's what I think he really thrived on is the social aspect of this golf club, and he did so much for it.
George Paul's love for sport can be traced back several decades. Rob Fast currently works as the head greenskeeper at Steinbach Fly-In, but recalls his first meeting with George while still in his early teens.
My earliest memories of George Pauls, just like the other men in this community that have been born and raised here, we all played Little League, and George Pauls was a huge organizer of Little League as when we were young men in the early 60s, mid-60s. So I was on George's hardball team for 3 years. He was my coach, the Blue Sox. And what a real treat for me as a young man was watching the way George handled the hardball and the bat and his mitt with only one arm. And it was just fascinating to see him at home plate, catching the ball, putting the glove underneath his stump, and actually hitting balls out to us and warming us up in the infield. So that's a very, very early kind of recollection about George, and just all the work that he did for Little League.
George Pauls was known in the community as the man who got things done. And when a go-to guy was needed, George was your man. He gave selflessly of his time and often his personal finances. And if he saw a need, he was often the first to step up to the plate.
George liked to be behind. He was off the radar. He didn't want a lot of people to know what he was doing to help people. And I remember being at the food bank during the opening, the grand opening, and George came, and I was sort of surprised to see him there. And he handed a check to me to give to the treasurer of the food bank, and I had to look at it and I almost fell down, but he didn't want anybody to know, anybody else there to know that what he was doing. It was just on him, and that's the kind of guy he was.
The same could be said for George's involvement with both the Steinbach Fly-In Golf Club and the Steinbach Curling Club. Abe Clausen, president of the Curling Club, says that George Pauls came to the club's financial rescue on more than one occasion.
Typically, all curling clubs are always in financial problems or difficulties. We can't make our ends meet, kind of, and if we needed something, the club needed any kind of a boost, and he was always there. And you wouldn't have to ask him; he'd volunteer it. So, yeah, that's with George.
We had the Senior Interclub here, Manitoba Senior Interclub, a few years ago, and George was involved in organizing, and he said, Steinbach Golf Club will do it, and we had the guys over, and when it came down to prizing, it was maybe a little bit short. It looked a little chintzy, and George threw in a few $100s. Let's make it better and bigger and better, and let's make sure everybody has a prize when they get home. And lots of things like that.
Aside from his connection to George as a kid playing baseball, Rob Fast developed another unique connection to Pauls as an adult.
Growing up as a young kid, we all knew that George was a veteran, obviously, and when my military Canadian history got the better of me, and I started to restore these vehicles, and I wanted the public to remember Canadian military history. George and I kind of had a connection there, and at all of these parades, I've always asked Legion members to participate and ride with me in these parades, and George was always the first one there. He was a huge Legion promoter, and so it was always a big day for myself and my brother, who's also a partner in this military vehicle restoration thing, and just enjoyed riding with George and reminiscing at the Legion after.
George Pauls has left a huge void in the Steinbach community with his passing, but has also left behind a great legacy and fond memories for those who knew him best.
He was incredible. There'll never be another George. There's only one. They've broken the mold. He loved his friends. He was a great friend, generous to a fault. His support for local community efforts, especially the food bank and this golf club, just an incredible guy.
He'll be remembered through a lot of the things that he started. Will go on and on. The George Pauls Golf Classic, his contributions to the curling club, to the golf course, to the kids in town. All those kids have grown up and kind of emulate what George brought to the community. One of the most generous people I've ever known. He loved the community, he loved his family. You couldn't find a better friend than George.
I can't think of any one person that has done more for the golf club on the social aspect side of the club than George Pauls. I can't think of anybody. There are some employees here that were paid to do it and to generate golf business. But just for the love of the game and the social aspect of the club, George was, I can't think of anybody that's done more.
It's just an amazing story. And he had an amazing life. And, we all wish that on everybody. I'm just glad that, I got to know him.
For Steinbach Online, I'm Karen Block.